January 17, 1945. The Rhine River Valley near Strasbourg. Dawn. The morning mist clung to the frozen earth like a burial shroud. German forward observers huddled in their concrete bunkers along the western bank, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. Through field glasses smudged with condensation, they watched the Allied lines across the water. The smell of coal smoke and damp stone filled their cramped positions. For weeks, they had monitored every movement, every supply convoy, every shift in the American deployment. They knew the rhythm of their enemy now, or so they believed. What they saw that morning would shatter their confidence in everything they thought they understood about American warfare. The war had entered its final, desperate phase. Germany's once mighty Wehrmacht had been ground down through years of attrition on two fronts. The industrial cities of the Ruhr lay in ruins beneath Allied bombs. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking. Young boys and old men now filled the ranks that had once boasted the finest soldiers in Europe. Yet the German defensive doctrine remained sophisticated, built on years of hard-won experience. Intelligence gathering had become an obsession. Every piece of information about Allied strength, positioning, and capability was cataloged, analyzed, reported up the chain of command. The officers who interpreted this intelligence were not fools. They were veterans of Stalingrad, of Kursk, of 1,000 brutal engagements. They had learned to read the patterns of war like farmers read the sky. That morning the pattern broke. The German observers spotted them first, tanks rolling into position on the far bank, Sherman medium tanks easily identifiable by their silhouette. The watchers counted them methodically. 10, 15, 20. More arriving hourly. They noted the positions, sketched the deployments, transmitted their reports. The Americans were massing armor for a crossing operation. Standard procedure. Expected. The German artillery officers calculated firing solutions. Anti-tank crews checked their remaining ammunition. Everyone knew what was coming, except something felt wrong. One observer, a veteran Unteroffizier named Klaus Hoffmann, who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, noticed it first. The tanks weren't moving like tanks. Through his binoculars, he watched a Sherman settle into position near a grove of bare trees. The way it moved seemed off, too light, too quick, as if the massive vehicle weighed nothing. He mentioned it to his lieutenant, who dismissed the observation. Battle fatigue, perhaps. Too many months at the front. But Hoffmann couldn't shake the feeling. He kept watching. As the sun rose higher, burning away the mist, more tanks appeared. The German commanders revised their estimates upward. 30 tanks, 40, 50. An entire armored division concentrating for the assault. The reports flew back to headquarters. Emergency redeployments began. Precious reserves, the last mobile units available, started moving toward Strasbourg to meet the American armored threat. Artillery ammunition, already desperately scarce, was redistributed to positions overlooking the likely crossing points. Every resource, every gun, every man who could be spared shifted to face the coming onslaught. And then someone noticed the wind. A gust of cold January air swept across the river valley. One of the American tanks, a Sherman positioned prominently near the water's edge, shifted slightly. Not the turret, the entire tank. It rocked gently, almost imperceptibly like a boat at anchor. Another gust, another subtle movement. Hoffmann pressed his binoculars so hard against his face they left marks. He watched the tank sway. Real armor, 40 tons of steel and engine, did not sway in the breeze. The realization spread through the German positions like ice water through the veins. Some laughed, some cursed, some simply stared in disbelief. The Americans had deployed inflatable tanks, rubber decoys, movie props. The entire armored concentration was a lie. Young German soldiers, those who still possessed a sense of humor after years of grinding war, began to mock what they saw. Look at the American desperation. Look at their pathetic tricks, trying to frighten us with balloons like children afraid of shadows. The mocking spread. Radio communications crackled with derisive laughter. Intelligence officers who had redirected precious resources based on the decoy threat faced angry questions from their commanders. The Americans had wasted German time and attention, yes, but they had also revealed their own weakness. If they needed to resort to such transparent deceptions, perhaps they were not as strong as everyone feared. The laughter lasted approximately 11 minutes. At 8:47 hours, the first ranging shot from American artillery screamed across the river. Then another. Then a barrage that turned the morning into thunder. The German positions erupted in explosions of frozen earth and shattered concrete. The observers who had mocked the inflatable tanks moments before now pressed themselves flat against the floor of their bunkers, hands over their ears, mouths open to equalize the pressure that threatened to burst their eardrums. The barrage walked methodically across the German defensive line, destroying communication trenches, collapsing bunkers, severing telephone wires. It was the most intense artillery preparation some of the veterans had experienced since the great Soviet offensives of the previous summer. And then through the smoke and dust they came. Real tanks, actual armor, not rubber decoys but genuine American Sherman tanks, fresh from the depot, engines roaring, treads grinding. Behind them, the newer M26 Pershing heavy tanks that German intelligence had only recently confirmed were arriving in the theater. Dozens of them, appearing as if conjured from nothing, rolling toward crossing points 3 kilometers south of where the inflatable decoys still bobbed gently in the morning breeze. The entire German defensive plan had been oriented toward the wrong sector. The reserves had been moved to face a phantom threat. The real assault hit where the line was thinnest, where the exhausted defenders had been told no major attack was expected. Klaus Hoffmann, still alive in his bunker despite the barrage, watched the actual tanks advance and understood what had happened. The Americans had not revealed weakness. They had revealed something far more frightening, abundance so complete they could afford to waste resources on deception. They had rubber to spare for fake tanks. They had real tanks to spare for the actual assault. They had artillery ammunition to spare for a barrage that would have bankrupted the entire German ammunition budget for the sector. Where Germany scraped together every shell, every gallon of fuel, every replacement part through increasingly desperate improvisation, America simply produced more. The inflatable tanks were not a sign of desperation. They were a sign of surplus. An army that could field rubber decoys and real armor simultaneously was an army that could not be defeated by any calculation Germany could make. The psychological impact cut deeper than any artillery shell. German soldiers had been told for years that America was soft, that its industrial might was overstated, that its soldiers lacked the martial spirit of the German warrior. They had been told the Americans would break. Instead, the Americans had just used toy tanks to manipulate an entire German defensive deployment, then followed with an armored spearhead that smashed through the disrupted lines in less than 2 hours. The operation was not desperate. It was almost casual. The Americans had turned warfare into a kind of industrial theater where even the props were real enough to draw an entire army out of position. The unit responsible for this particular deception was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, though the German soldiers pinned down in their bunkers that January morning did not know its designation. They would have been even more unsettled if they had known the full scope of what they faced. The 23rd specialized in what would later be called tactical deception. Their arsenal included inflatable tanks, fake artillery pieces, dummy landing craft, and sound trucks that broadcast recorded tank noises. They employed artists and designers recruited from advertising agencies and art schools. They created entire phantom armies through careful stage management. But the genius of their work lay not in the quality of the deceptions themselves. The inflatable tanks fooled no one who got close, but in how those deceptions were deployed as part of a larger operational strategy. The doctrine was simple but required resources most armies could not spare. Create a threat. Make it visible and credible enough to force a response. Monitor how the enemy reallocates to meet that threat. Strike where they have weakened themselves. The inflatable tanks were never meant to fool anyone indefinitely. They only needed to hold attention long enough for the real forces to exploit the gaps created by the enemy's redeployment. It was warfare as misdirection, and it worked because America could afford to maintain both the illusion and the reality simultaneously. German military intelligence had documented American material superiority in countless reports. The numbers were undeniable. American factories produced more tanks in a month than German factories produced in a year. American supply ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys so large they blackened the sea. American soldiers ate fresh food from cans, while German soldiers made soup from nettles and roots. But numbers on a page could be compartmentalized, explained away, endured. What could not be endured was the casual demonstration of that superiority in action. The inflatable tanks represented something more demoralizing than 100 statistical reports. They represented an enemy that had so much of everything that they could afford to waste resources on theater, on art, on deception for its own sake. The symbolic weight of those rubber tanks would echo through the remaining months of the war. As German soldiers retreated across their own territory, as the supply situation deteriorated from critical to catastrophic, as the thousand-year Reich collapsed into rubble and ruin, the memory remained. The Americans had mocked them with balloons, then buried them with steel. The psychological sequence was deliberate. First, make them feel superior, let them laugh at the obvious decoys. Then, show them what real strength looked like. The whiplash from contempt to terror was more effective than simple, overwhelming force would have been. It broke something in the mind, the assumption that German military professionalism and tactical sophistication could compensate for material disadvantage. Klaus Hoffmann survived the war. In the decades after, he would tell the story of that morning to anyone who would listen. Not as a tale of German defeat, those stories were too common to be remarkable, but as an illustration of what they had truly faced. He would describe the moment of realization, watching the rubber tank sway in the wind, feeling the brief surge of contemptuous amusement, then hearing the artillery barrage begin moments later. He would talk about the sound of real tanks, dozens of them, appearing where they were not supposed to be, where every intelligence report said they could not be. He would explain that Germany had not lost the war because its soldiers lacked courage or its commanders lacked skill. Germany had lost because it fought an enemy that could afford to deploy both fake armies and real ones simultaneously, an enemy for whom the question was never, do we have enough? But rather, where should we use what we have? The inflatable tank operation at Strasbourg was replicated in various forms across the European theater during the final months of the war. Before the Rhine crossings, phantom armies drew German attention while real forces massed elsewhere. Before the breakout from Normandy, rubber tanks and fake radio traffic suggested Allied strength in sectors that were actually being denuked for the main assault. The Germans adapted, learning to verify visual sightings, to distrust initial intelligence reports, to hold reserves longer before committing them. But adaptation only went so far when the underlying problem was insurmountable. Even when German intelligence correctly identified which American concentrations were real and which were decoys, the Americans had enough real forces to make multiple simultaneous attacks viable. The deception did not need to be perfect. It only needed to introduce doubt, to force the defenders to split their attention, to make every decision a gamble. What the German soldiers could not have known, freezing in their bunkers that January morning, was how the inflatable tanks were manufactured. In American factories far from the front, workers molded and stitched the rubber that would become dummy armor. These were the same factories that produced real ammunition, real vehicles, real aircraft. The capacity to produce both deceptions and actual weapons from the same industrial base represented a kind of abundance that Germany, with its ersatz substitutes and desperate resource conservation, simply could not comprehend. American factories made rubber tanks because they had spare capacity. German factories by 1945 struggled to produce enough real tanks to replace combat losses. The food situation told the same story. American soldiers in the field ate from rations that included meat, chocolate, cheese, coffee. The infamous C ration and K ration were objects of complaint among American troops, who found them monotonous and uninspiring. German soldiers who captured American supplies found the rations almost incomprehensible. This much food for one man for one day. This much sugar, this much fat, this much protein. The caloric content of a single day's American combat ration exceeded what many German soldiers received over 3 days by 1945. The gap was not merely material, it was philosophical. America projected power through abundance. Germany demanded sacrifice for survival. The contrast was visible in every aspect of the war, from the rubber tanks to the food supplies to the casual waste of ammunition, in preparatory barrages that German commanders could never afford to replicate. The Rhine crossing operation succeeded. American forces established bridgeheads, pushed through the German defensive lines, began the final advance into the industrial heartland of the Reich. The inflatable tanks, their deception complete, were deflated and packed away, ready for the next operation. Some were damaged by German artillery fire and discarded. Some were captured by advancing German units in brief local counterattacks, providing momentary satisfaction to soldiers who could finally confirm what they had suspected. The Americans were indeed using rubber fakes. But the satisfaction was hollow. Finding a deflated rubber tank did not change the fact that real tanks were already across the river, already grinding forward, already collapsing the defensive line. In the final accounting of the war, the inflatable tanks were a footnote. They did not win battles through their own action. They enabled real forces to win battles by drawing enemy attention and resources away from critical points. But their symbolic importance exceeded their tactical value. They represented a particular kind of American warfare, industrial, theatrical, wasteful by necessity, effective through abundance. Where European military tradition valued efficiency and elegance, American doctrine valued overwhelming application of resources. Where German commanders tried to achieve maximum effect with minimum means, American commanders asked what maximum means could achieve. The inflatable tanks embodied that philosophy. They were an investment in deception that only an army with surplus capacity could afford to make. The historical record shows that Operation Viersen, the crossing operation at Strasbourg, was not the largest or most decisive Rhine crossing of 1945. That distinction belongs to other operations, other battles, other names that appear more prominently in the official histories. But the soldiers who were there, who experienced the sequence of rubber decoys followed by real armor, carried something different away from that engagement. They carried the understanding that they faced an enemy that operated by different rules, with different assumptions about what was possible, what was necessary, what could be risked. The inflatable tanks became, in memory, representatives of the entire American way of war, surprising, unconventional, backed by resources that seemed limitless. When German commanders later analyzed the defeat, when military historians wrote their assessments, when veterans gathered to remember, the inflatable tanks appeared again and again in the discussions. Not as a major factor in the outcome. The war's result was determined by larger strategic realities, but as a symbol of the disconnect between what Germany could field and what America deployed. The story became almost mythical in its retelling. The mocking laughter, the sudden artillery barrage, the real tanks that followed. The sequence condensed the entire material imbalance of the war into a single morning's experience. The rubber that formed those inflatable tanks was produced from trees grown in Liberia, Malaysia, and Brazil, processed in American factories, shaped by American workers who would never see the European front, shipped across the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyers that burned fuel oil refined from Texas crude, unloaded at French ports by logistics units that operated with timetable precision, transported to forward positions by trucks that were themselves symbols of American industrial might. The supply chain that delivered a single inflatable tank represented a global network of resource extraction, industrial production, and military logistics that no other nation could replicate. Germany knew this. The German High Command had studied American industrial capacity before the war began. They had calculated correctly that America could outproduce Germany by orders of magnitude once its full industrial potential was mobilized for war production. What they had not calculated, what they could not fully anticipate, was how that production capacity would translate into tactical and operational possibilities that simply did not exist for armies operating under resource constraints. The inflatable tanks were impossible in the German context, not because German engineers lacked the technical knowledge to produce them. The concept was simple enough, but because German logistics could not spare the rubber, the transport, the personnel, or the operational attention required to deploy them. Every resource had to be allocated to immediate, direct combat effectiveness. There was no surplus for deception, no excess capacity for theater, no room for anything that did not kill the enemy or protect friendly forces in the most straightforward possible way. American abundance permitted experimentation. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops included sonic deception units that broadcast recorded tank and truck noises to simulate unit movements. They operated fake radio networks with authentic-sounding but meaningless traffic to suggest the presence of headquarters that did not exist. They deployed actual soldiers to impersonate generals, complete with insignia and staff cars, in locations where the real commanders were not present. The entire apparatus was dedicated to making the enemy see things that were not there, believe things that were not true, respond to threats that were phantoms. This kind of warfare required surplus equipment, surplus personnel, surplus attention, surplus everything. Germany had no surplus. Germany, by 1945, barely had sufficiency. The contrast extended beyond the material into the cultural and ideological. American military culture, shaped by a civilian industrial economy, approached problems with an engineer's mindset. If deception provided tactical advantage, manufacture the tools of deception. If rubber tanks worked, make more rubber tanks. If the enemy adapted, develop new deception methods. The approach was pragmatic, flexible, willing to try unconventional solutions if they produced results. German military culture, shaped by a warrior aristocracy and decades of tradition, valued honor, direct confrontation, and tactical elegance. Deception was certainly part of German doctrine. Blitzkrieg itself relied on surprise and misdirection. But the German approach emphasized concentrating real strength at decisive points, not creating phantom strength to disperse enemy forces. The philosophical gap was as wide as the material gap. Klaus Hoffmann, in his later years, would sometimes wonder what would have happened if the positions had been reversed. If Germany had possessed America's resources and America had fought with German constraints. The hypothetical was pointless, he knew. The resources were not reversible. Geography, demography, industrial capacity, access to raw materials, all of these factors were fixed realities that no amount of wishful thinking could change. Germany fought the war it could fight with what it had. America fought the war its capabilities permitted. The inflatable tanks were not a clever trick that Germany could have copied with different leadership or better decisions. They were a manifestation of structural advantages that existed before the war began and shaped every aspect of how the war was fought. The final irony, evident to Hoffmann and other veterans who survived to think about these things in peace, was that the inflatable tanks made them complicit in their own defeat. The German High Command prided itself on professional military excellence, on careful intelligence analysis, on rational decision-making based on accurate information. But when presented with the inflatable tanks, they responded exactly as they were supposed to respond. They redeployed forces to meet the visible threat. They concentrated attention and resources on the decoys. And in doing so, they created the conditions for the real attack to succeed. Their professionalism made them predictable. Their rational response to false information was itself a tactical error. The Americans had not simply outproduced Germany. They had outthought them at the operational level, using Germany's own tactical sophistication against itself. This realization was perhaps more disturbing than simple material defeat would have been. An army could lose because it was outnumbered, outgunned, or outmaneuvered. Those were honorable defeats, the kind that military tradition could process and respect. But to lose because the enemy had manipulated your perceptions, because you had been made to see what was not there and fail to see what was, because your own careful analysis had been anticipated and exploited, that cut deeper. The inflatable tanks represented a kind of defeat that undermined the entire framework through which German military culture understood warfare. They suggested that mass-produced deception, industrial-scale trickery, could defeat professional military excellence. They suggested that in modern industrial warfare, the factories mattered more than the fighters. January 17, 1945 receded into history. The war ground on for a few more months until the inevitable conclusion. Germany surrendered. Europe began the long process of reconstruction. The inflatable tanks were mostly destroyed or scrapped. A few survived in museums, curiosities from a war that had pioneered so many new forms of destruction and deception. The soldiers who had seen them, who had laughed at them, who had been buried by the artillery barrage that followed, carried the memory forward into a world that tried hard to forget the details of the war while remembering its lessons. The lesson of the inflatable tanks was simple but absolute. Material abundance, properly applied, created tactical and strategic possibilities that could not be countered by skill, courage, or tactical excellence alone. An army that could afford to deploy both deceptions and overwhelming force simultaneously was an army that could not be defeated by conventional calculations. The rubber tanks were not weapons. They were symptoms of a larger condition: American industrial supremacy translated into military power through logistics, production, and imagination. They were freedom made visible, democracy rendered as surplus capacity, the American way of war distilled into a single absurd and effective instrument. And in the end, when the veterans on both sides grew old and the memories faded, what remained was the image: rubber tanks swaying in the January wind, real tanks thundering forward minutes later, and between those two moments, the shattering of every assumption about what was possible, what was rational, what could be endured. The Germans had mocked the inflatable tanks. The inflatable tanks had done exactly what they were designed to do, and behind them came the steel, the fire, and the inexorable weight of an industrial democracy at war.